With all the hype surrounding The Witcher through the books, the games, and most recently the Netflix series, I decided to give the games a shot, starting naturally with the first one. After having finished, please, for the love of God, don't do what I just did. This game has not aged well. To say that is a massive understatement. This game is really, really, really rough. In fact, I have a sneaking suspicion that even back in its day, it still sucked. The visuals are legitimately difficult to look at. At times, semi-realistic limbs contort into foreign angles, sometimes relatively okay models twist into legitimately creepy facial expressions. Tie all of that together with some less than stellar voice acting.
'Twas my first time witnessing a witch's sword in action. I've no desire to see more.
The whole product feels very off. This game is a poster child for the Uncanny Valley. None of this is a deal breaker though. Having grown up on Nintendo games, I'm used to graphics not really being the highest priority. The far bigger and much more damning problem is the gameplay. The single greatest descriptor of this game is tedious. I say that as nicely as possible. I did eventually come to enjoy my experiences with The Witcher, but so many aspects of this game just boil down to connected, incredibly tedious and repetitive moments. To be fair, credit where it's due, several things were done well. The issue is that most of these good moments and ideas were hidden behind gruelingly mediocre gameplay. If you stripped away the combat, the traveling, and turned this game into a visual novel, I actually think this game would be improved, and I am not particularly fond of visual novels. With that in mind, let's break down a little more specifically some of the good and bad aspects of this game.
Willing to die for that greedy Dwan. You're not one of them.
Bad. The combat. The first and immediately noticeable problem is the combat. The combat is horrendous. I cannot stress this enough. Even for its time, this was done so poorly. They used the BioWare engine, so you can try to give them a pass, but they essentially turned KOTOR's combat into a rhythm game, but one that frequently does not register inputs and may randomly abort attacks in the middle of their animation. To call The Witcher a rhythm game might be overly simplistic, but I think it conveys the right point, or at least type of points. You click at the right time to chain your attacks together, and if you keep the chain up, you do more damage faster. Other than that, there's a rock, paper, scissors style stance system in which your stances deal more damage if used against the correct type of enemy. For instance, an armored enemy is weak to the strong stance, and an agile enemy is weak to the agile stance. There is some strategy involved, but very little. Your items and current character level have more to say about your DPS than any actual decisions on your part. The combat can be somewhat fun, but only in small bursts every once in a while. Unfortunately, the game throws combat at you constantly, especially when you leave the neutral areas. You are likely to stumble across encounter after encounter after encounter. The combat quickly devolves into a tedious chore to push through as quickly as possible, just to get from point A to point B. Good. Decisions. I have always loved meaningful decisions in games. The problem is, very few games actually utilize decisions well. The Telltale games, for instance, market that you are in control of the story based on your decisions. But that's bullshit. You simply slightly change the dialogue based on your decisions. The story remains largely unaffected. The Witcher, however, does make me feel in control. Even though the decisions don't change the overall plot, it does change enough to make me feel like my choices have weight. Some people's lives are affected by your choices. Some NPCs will die, some side quests will be altered or replaced or eliminated based on your choices. And many of these choices will actually bleed over into the next game or at least the next chapter. In The Witcher, more often than in other games, I found myself going out of the way to find more information before completing a mission, just to make sure that I was making the right choice or that there wasn't some other information I could use first. Which leads me to my next point. Open-ended gameplay. This one is both good and bad. On one hand, the game does not overtly tell me, hey, there's another decision if you go across town and talk to X, which means I, as the player, was responsible for looking into the facts myself. If you were not paying attention, it was entirely possible to just miss alternatives. This can be frustrating for some people, but this also feels a lot more realistic and believable than always explicitly being told, there is another option if you don't want to go through with this. While it was incredibly tedious, the second chapter is the best example of this. I needed to figure out who was guilty of murder and who was not. The game did not hold my hand. I had to look for information and evidence, in large part on my own, and then I had to confront the suspects and ultimately determine whether or not I believed them and what they had to say. Here's the thing. Even when you find irrefutable evidence, you can still choose to condemn them. The game doesn't force you to believe them, even when there is definitive proof. This is far more immersive than any other detective experience I've ever played in a game, even from games in which you control a detective. On the downside, it was also incredibly tedious, as I mentioned. There was an excessive amount of walking back and forth from one location to another and back again, searching for evidence that may or may not even exist, and some of the evidence could only be discovered at a certain time of day, which you have no way of knowing. There were often clues you can use to minimize the randomness, but it didn't entirely solve the problem. The section quickly established a repetitive order of events. Discover a potential lead, walk all the way across town to discover that information, then walk all the way back across town to where you started to confront the suspect, then repeat this several times for each suspect in each piece of information. Unfortunately, a good chunk of the information gathering presented as a string of unrelated fetch quests. This did not completely ruin the experience for me. I enjoyed finding new information, but it did make several sections exhausting, and I found myself having to take multiple breaks just to combat some of the monotony. Bad. Tedious information gathering. This was somewhat similar to the last point, but let me explain. Geralt has lost his memories. He can still fight, but apparently his vast knowledge of monsters, his entire life and career, that's missing. Ergo, you need to find information on everything before you can complete anything. Basically, you need to read up on monsters or plants before you can even harvest either of them. I understand and appreciate the principle. It would be nice in theory. The problem is that it adds an extra layer of tedium to every single quest. For example, let's say I need drops from a wraith. I know that those are wraiths, as the villager who ran screaming from the wraiths called them wraiths and asked me to kill the wraiths. However, I haven't read the book on wraiths. So I guess I can't complete the quest because I do not know that those wraiths are actually wraiths, even though Geralt literally verbalized this in response to the quest giver. Not every example is as ridiculous, though. I cannot harvest herbs that I cannot identify, therefore I need to read up on the herbs in the area. That is reasonable and it kind of makes sense. It's even a nice touch. Or at least it was the first 3 or so times that it happened. Since this happens multiple times for multiple quests, the immersion is just kind of replaced with irritation. Once again, in a seeming trend, it just makes everything feel very, very tedious. In order to read the book, you have to find the book. Where is the book, though? Sometimes it's given as a quest reward for something completely unrelated. Sometimes you just need to find someone who's selling it, and other times you find it in crypts or as drops from other monsters or creatures or people. Any of those situations would have been fine. Hell, even all of them would be fine. But since this is happening for every single side quest, it just becomes another monotonous step in an already monotonous quest in an already incredibly monotonous game. Good. Setting. This is a personal preference thing, but I'm always fond of RPGs being set in cities. I think cities are hugely underutilized as settings. Often people prefer, or at least marketing teams and devs prefer, huge, massive, sprawling hills and mountains, and this does look impressive, admittedly, at least on the box, but it's almost always lifeless, and it doesn't really translate well to actual games. Like I said, I know it's a personal preference thing, but it does affect my view of this game in particular. Setting the majority of the game in villages and cities results in a much more social RPG. Kind of. It forces you to engage with NPCs in a way you would not otherwise for most other games. The most immediately noticeable being that the various NPCs have more meaning. When monsters attack, they often target the civilians. You could ignore them, since I'm pretty sure they respawn at some point, but I found myself going out of my way to help random people in need. Maybe it's just because I'm a nurse, but I had a hard time turning my back on dying civilians. Setting the majority of the game in cities also helps establish and cement the social setting. Walking through the slums, you see oppressed non-humans complaining about the humans. Alternatively, you walk through the streets and hear humans making vague or overt racist statements towards the non-humans. The game doesn't need to tell me that humans are racist towards elves. They simply show me. Well, they also told me, repeatedly, at every turn, and in a good chunk of the cutscenes, and most of the fiction in-game, so whatever. They didn't need to, though. They could have gotten by without it. A city setting also forces you to acknowledge NPCs' importance. The important and named NPCs walk around and engage in varying degrees with the world and with Geralt. Therefore, when you have to make a decision that affects their fates and potentially their lives, it's a lot heavier and harder to choose between 2 bad choices. Setting most of the game in towns and cities does affect the speed, flow, and action within the game. I acknowledge that these are not done particularly well within this game, but as a whole I think the city was utilized very effectively. Bad. Forcing bad decisions. Forcing players to choose between 2 bad choices is nothing new, but this game felt like the devs were just waiting to say, "Ha! Gotcha! He was actually the bad guy, and you never expected it." But we did. We all saw it coming, and there was no alternative but to get tricked into apparently fully aligning yourself with an evil group. If you try to pull lazy plot twists, and you try to hide the fact that you're making a difficult decision, it minimizes the weight of those difficult decisions. It would have been much better to just go into it knowing full well that you had to choose the better of 2 evils. To an extent, anyway. Later on, you can ultimately choose a neutral path, but that was after a few forced decisions. It's not the worst, but it got old the first few times they tried to shock you with betrayal. In a way, it kind of takes away your agency. That kind of move rarely works in decision-heavy games that encourage independence. Good. Lowbrow. This is something I can get really into, so I'm not going to do that. I will waste way too much time. I'll try to keep this brief. This is debatable, but in my opinion, a good chunk of the time, fantasy is associated with high fantasy, also called epic fantasy. While there's plenty of diversity and subgenres within that scope, I think it's safe to say that the majority of high fantasy is very epic in nature, and this tends to come with themes of saving the world or fighting against a threatening evil, protecting the kingdom, etc. Movies, for sure, but even games and to a lesser degree books utilizing the setting tend to be moderately clean. Think The Lord of the Rings, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, these types of things. These shows rarely have swearing, they minimize sex, and generally stay very PG-13. Violence is usually the pushing factor, and even then it's usually fairly tame. Obviously there are plenty of notable exceptions. Conan the Barbarian and Game of Thrones are the first ones that just jump to mind. They exist for sure. What makes The Witcher interesting is a kind of blending of subgenres. The overall story of The Witcher is very epic fantasy in nature. There's an objectively evil group of fanatics that are evil just for the sake of being evil. The kingdom is under threat from civil war and actual war, and then there's also this plot against the whole known world. But at the same time, Geralt isn't really a huge part of this. He's an anti-hero despite the multiple choices you have. He has nothing but disdain for royalty or knights or really any of society at all.
Enjoying yourself?
Exquisitely. Not enough food, nowhere to sit, and nothing but small talk. And I may be the only one here not involved in one of the many schemes or secret alliances being forged.
But he gets roped into this epic fantasy story. He contributes to the plot, and he helps resolve the conflict, but he does so kind of indirectly and kind of beneath the surface of all of the epic fantasy elements. Using the in-game terminology, he helps the Witcher way, or the neutral way. He says it multiple times, sometimes forced and sometimes by decision, I am a Witcher, neutral, or I don't engage in politics. He doesn't give a shit.
Why do you want to draw me into a game that doesn't concern me?
This game concerns you more than you imagine. You mean to tell me you're not interested in the conflict between the Order and the Scoia'tael?
Throughout all the high fantasy elements of the game, Geralt seems to live just beneath the surface. He stays at brothels, he has sex, lots of it. He swears plenty, he engages in bar fights and drinking games, and he doesn't really embody any of the traditional aspects of a clean hero, or, to be fair, even an anti-hero. At the same time, the world we explore through him, his world, isn't particularly clean either, and the game does so without crossing the line into cringy or edgy, at least most of the time. My personal test for how games handle anti-heroes is to check how they handle swearing. In many games that try to challenge the clean, high fantasy stereotypes, you see some really forced swearing. It feels unnatural and wannabe edgy.
But what I really need is some way to blow off steam, not a fucking combat lesson. Okay, shut the fuck up, alright? I'll catch up with you.
In this game, swearing just rolls off the tongue, even some pretty strong language. I can see this being a massive turnoff for some, but this feels refreshingly grounded in a high fantasy setting.
Conniver who buys debts to feel important, to have power over people if only for a moment.
That hurt, Geralt.
You talk a bundle, but when push comes to shove, you hide under the city guard's bibs. You lack balls.
Shut the fuck up.
Stop pretending you have principles.
Despite all that leads me to my next negative, the sex. Look, I don't give a shit about fan service or sex in games. It really doesn't bother me at all. I'm a nurse, I've seen everything. There are plenty of options to have sex in this game. Some are hard to obtain, some are basically just handed to you, one of which is practically canon. None of them make any logical sense though, at all. I guess Geralt is supposed to have some massive charisma despite kind of grunting two-word responses to every question. At one point, you are talking to somebody who attempts to prove to you that she is innocent. She then states something along the lines of, well, perhaps I can persuade you some other way, or something like that. And as the player, you can choose to accept her sexual advances or not. Like I said, I don't really care about sex or fan service in games. And I would turn down her advances because that would be the ethical thing to do, and that's just kind of crossing a line for me. But here's the catch. They turned sex into a collectible. I gotta get the collectibles, man. So despite feeling gross, I went ahead and went with that. And here's the thing. I don't care about fan service in games. I've said this 3 times now. But getting ironically more explicit softcore porn cards in exchange for really contrived sexual encounters and really weird sex scenes, that's a bit much, even for me. I've never been one to complain about objectification in games, but I felt gross about that one. Well, getting near the end of this, I'm sure this comes as no surprise, but the final bad thing about this game is the goddamn traveling. For fuck's sake, give us a fucking fast travel option. Running back and forth for 20 minutes really kills the momentum. I appreciate how grounded this game tried to be, but there's a point that you cross to where it's just really goddamn irritating. And fuck me, most of the game was just running back and forth. In conclusion, ironically enough, I actually ended up liking the game. It took a lot of time. Unfortunately, the first chapter was a horrible introduction, but the game does get a little better afterwards. Once I started to accept the game as it was, I started to have a good time playing it. I was oddly invested in the world and the characters of the game, and the side quests really helped add life to towns even if they were soul-crushing to play through. It still felt like more of an in-depth visual novel. If you stripped away the senseless traveling and crappy-ass combat, the story and the writing were actually half decent. The choices and consequences were implemented fairly well. Like I said, I can't recommend the game. In fact, I actively do not recommend the game. You should not play this game unless you really, really just want more Witcher. But you'll have to fight to actually finish the game. I only pushed through to the end because I was invested in the Witcher. Well, no, that's not true. I only pushed through to the end because I was recording this. It wasn't a horrible game. Well, it definitely wasn't good. I can excuse the pacing and flaws because it was an older game, but I'll be honest, I think this was rough when it originally came out, and I would give this a 6 out of 10 based on the good parts, and that's being very generous, I think. I don't think most people will stick around long enough to appreciate it, and I don't even think most people should. It's heartbreaking because they had some really, really good ideas, but the overall game is so bad, I can't recommend it.